The Channel Islands of California are a fascinating group of islands. I've already made a video about how climate change will impact them, but there is so much more to explore when it comes to these islands. This video will unpack the history of conservation on the islands, from indigenous practices to the founding of Channel Islands National Park to the current restoration of damaged ecosystems on the islands. The Channel Islands are such a unique island chain because they are far enough from shore that many of the animals there have evolved differently from their mainland counterparts. In fact, because of this, the Channel Islands have 145 species found nowhere else on Earth. The Channel Islands have been home to humans for thousands of years. The oldest archaeological findings on the islands date back 13,000 years, and there is evidence of continuous occupation of some of the islands dating back 11,000 years. The Chumash indigenous people were the main group on the islands, and they mainly inhabited the northern Channel Islands, though they did have a presence on the other islands alongside other indigenous groups. These indigenous communities relied on the natural resources from the islands and the surrounding ocean, and they were able to live in balance with nature for thousands of years. Through their maritime networks, they also traded with indigenous communities on the other islands and the mainland, creating a balanced network of people and the environment. While many of the southern islands remained largely uninhabited due to the lack of freshwater available year-round, they did serve as seasonal outposts. By the time Europeans arrived, there were 21 villages on the largest of the northern Channel Islands. When European colonizers arrived, they forcibly moved many indigenous peoples to newly built missions. These were religious labor camps where indigenous peoples were forced to work in brutal, inhumane conditions and were exposed to diseases from Europe for which they had not built up immunities. In total, nearly a third of the indigenous people in California died as a direct result of the missions. By the 1820s, the last indigenous inhabitants of the islands had been forcibly moved to the mainland. As time went on, the Chumash people were further marginalized, and their connection with the Channel Islands was largely severed. By the 19th century, the islands contained vast sheep and cattle ranches, and the surrounding oceans were aggressively harvested. These practices greatly damaged the ecosystems of portions of the islands and waters. In the 1930s, there were calls to protect the islands among scientists who recognized their importance to natural history, and in 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt designated two of the northern Channel Islands, Anacapa Island and Santa Barbara Island, as Channel Islands National Monument. 8 years later, the protected area was expanded to cover the ocean within a mile of the shoreline of these islands. In the 1960s, there was renewed interest in protecting the islands, and there were many calls to expand the protected area to include more of the islands and waters. After years of political delays and failures, Channel Islands National Park was finally established in 1980. It included all of Channel Islands National Monument, as well as Santa Rosa Island, Santa Cruz Island, and San Miguel Island. One of the main reasons there were so many delays in creating this national park was because Santa Cruz Island was privately owned by the Nature Conservancy, and Santa Rosa and San Miguel Islands were owned by the military, so arrangements had to be worked out if tourists were to visit the islands. In the end, the Nature Conservancy donated a portion of Santa Cruz Island to the National Park Service to be open to the public, and the two military islands ended up allowing tourism managed by the Park Service. The National Park only protected the islands themselves, so to protect the waters around them, Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary was established in 1980. It provides use regulations for a larger area of ocean around these islands, meaning massive fishing fleets and offshore oil rigs can't be right next to the islands. In 2003, California created 13 additional marine protected areas within the sanctuary, providing further protections. These increased regulations and enforcement are effectively stopping illegal fishing inside the boundaries of the protected area and are conserving targeted species. While these protections were greatly needed in preserving the wonderful ecosystems of the Channel Islands, portions of the islands had already been severely damaged, so rehabilitation efforts were badly needed. Many of the Channel Islands were damaged in similar ways, so the restoration efforts on Santa Cruz Island serve as a good case study for the rehabilitation efforts. When white settlers arrived on the island, they cleared native shrubs from parts of it, introducing non-native pigs and fennel, an invasive weed. The pigs would tear out native species, and the fennel would then grow in its place. The native organisms' isolation from the mainland left them incredibly vulnerable, so these introduced species wreaked havoc. Some organisms, like the Santa Barbara Island song sparrow and the Santa Cruz Island monkey flower, were driven to local extinction on the island, and many more species were pushed to the edge of extinction. The pigs also provided a reliable food source for golden eagles, which were previously rarely seen on these islands. These golden eagles then started hunting the Santa Cruz Island foxes, bringing them closer to extinction, since the foxes had not previously had this type of predator. The pigs also damaged a large number of archaeological sites on the island, many of which are sacred to the Chumash people. Invasive species were not the only harms to the island. For example, the native bald eagles, which fed on fish, seabirds, and animal carcasses, were driven from the island in the 1950s because of DDT poisoning, a result of excessive insecticide use. All told, the ecosystems on Santa Cruz Island were pretty wrecked by the time it was protected as part of the national park. But these added protections also gave the island the boost in conservation efforts that it needed. Over the past couple of decades, the National Park Service, along with groups such as Channel Islands Restoration and the Nature Conservancy, have worked to restore the damaged ecosystems. Pigs were eradicated from the island, the golden eagles were relocated to Northern California, a captive breeding program was set up to restore fox populations, bald eagles were reintroduced, and there are ongoing efforts to remove fennel and restore native plant populations. Similar restoration efforts took place on the other islands in the national park, such as Santa Barbara Island, where European rabbits were eradicated, and San Miguel Island, where sheep were eradicated. The national park still doesn't encompass all of the Channel Islands. San Nicolas and San Clemente Islands are military-owned and are still closed to the public, though there are conservation efforts on both of these islands. The nonprofit group Channel Islands Restoration has worked with the Navy to eradicate invasive species and restore native ones on these islands. Additionally, Santa Catalina Island, the only island with commercial development, is not part of the national park. Instead, the Catalina Island Conservancy has worked hard to ensure that the island's natural wonder is preserved. They have ongoing invasive species removal and native species restoration programs, and they work to build and maintain trails to allow people to experience the beauty of the park. But Catalina's long history of ranching and development means restoration is a more daunting task than on some of the other islands. For example, there are at least 80 invasive species on the island, including a large swath of introduced herbivores, such as deer, goats, pigs, and even bison, all of which have had a negative impact on local ecosystems. Conservation groups such as the Catalina Island Conservancy and Channel Islands Restoration have had a lot of success restoring ecosystems on this island, but there is still a long way to go. The Channel Islands provide a unique case study for environmental conservation. They are greatly damaged by human activity, but people are now working to repair this damage. Across human history, we have damaged countless ecosystems and destroyed many natural wonders in the name of progress. It's past time we reevaluate what progress really means and work to restore these wonderful places. We have been stewards of the land before. Let's do it again.